We're going to start with this panel on the next generation military threats, and then we're going to go to a topic that's near and dear to everybody's heart, which is making defense more affordable, the holy grail, and hopefully we'll get some insights there. We're also going to talk about how UAV technology is going to impact aviation. As we heard earlier, you know, that is going to be an industry-changing event and is becoming increasingly democratized, as we saw in one of the presentations this morning. And then obviously the role of aviation in humanitarian and disaster relief, given that HADR is an important thing and is even enshrined, for example, in U.S. strategy, but as well in Australia and a number of other countries, about what an important bridge-building tool that is. We're meeting at a tumultuous time, obviously, in global security. Russia has Europe on edge. China is the same in the Asia-Pacific, where its sweeping territorial claims to the South and East China Seas have everybody very, very worried. Obviously, this region is not without its challenges. The Syrian civil war is at best at a pause button. There's conflict ongoing in Yemen. The fight against ISIS continues. And it remains unclear what the outlook is for Iran in the wake of the nuclear deal. There are those who hope that it's going to become a more constructive player. On the other hand, there's also evidence that the Iranians are being somewhat less than cooperative. It's against this backdrop that also technology cycles, as again we heard in the morning session, every form of technology is accelerating, from materials to communications to nano to bio. Manufacturing is taking an accelerated leap ahead. And so that is good news for good guys, but also good news for bad guys. And so one of the challenges that DoD is working with and looking at in terms of crafting its third offset strategy and entire innovation pitch is to figure out how the United States and its allies stay ahead of this fast-moving, democratized power curve of technology that can be used by everybody. And every single one of the adversaries arrayed against the United States and its allies know that anti-access area denial systems are increasingly important to try to negate every one of the systemic advantages that the United States and its allies have spent many decades investing on, whether they're space systems, whether they're strike systems, whether they're defensive systems. So it really does pose quite a dramatic challenge. And the thing is that the technology centers now are distributed around the world. It's not just the United States and the Russians, but you know, obviously the Chinese, the Brazilians, and the United Arab Emirates, not just because they're our host today, has had a dramatic acceleration of technology and is increasingly a player, and there are other countries obviously that are trying to replicate the same sort of capabilities. Joining us today for our discussion on predicting and counteracting the next generation military threats is retired U.S. Navy Vice Admiral Bob Harward, a veteran U.S. Navy SEAL operator and former Deputy Commander of the United States Central Command, who's now Lockheed Martin's Vice President in the region. Dr. Ted Karasik, a seasoned analyst who spent many decades studying the Middle East. Chris Davis, who oversees Raytheon's Middle East unit, and Simon Carroll, who's Saab's man in the Middle East as well, and a distinguished Royal Australian Navy air warfare operator. We would not want to sully that with the word engineer anywhere near.
Thank you.
With that, gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us today. Admiral, I'd like to start with you. You know, as you look at next generation threats, whether they're symmetric or asymmetric or even black swan events, how do you see the future and the best way to sort of counteract some of these challenges?
One thing I was curious, you didn't mention North Korea. You know, where
that's true. I'm sorry.
Miss all the places, miss North Korea and what they're proposing right now, that they're going to launch a missile, maybe a nuclear armament, is indicative of this uncertain future we see ahead. So we know these existential threats, especially here in the region, as you deal with nation states such as Iran that pose an existential threat should they acquire a nuclear weapon to the region and our allies throughout the region. And you look at these newer existential threats that we had missed almost completely, these radical jihadist movements gaining capabilities like a nation state. working in ungoverned spaces to challenge the authority and the viability of nation states in the regions are indicative. But we still have these rogue players out there, such as North Korea. So I think any and all of these events are incumbent on a national defense system that keeps us ahead of those threats. And you mentioned black swans. There's so many more out there today than ever before. And this was the issue as we look at Iran. If it was able to become a nuclear arms facility, there would be other nations who would want to ensure they had that capability as a standoff against that. So I think all of these are indicative of the threats and what we're going to have to deal with. And I applaud the defense industry, who at a time has really risen to the challenge and is innovating, bringing technology to bear, that's staying ahead of some of these curves. And UAE is probably the perfect example of it. If you look at the THAAD system that is coming online here in UAE, that's nowhere else in the world except a U.S. system that was deployed in the region in Asia because of the North Korean threat. So UAE and its partnership with the United States, the defense industry was able to bring top-line capabilities that enables them to defend themselves against this imminent threat. So I think that's indicative of the partnership, what we're going to need the defense industry to do, working with the services and our allies to stay ahead of the threat. So it's a great time to be a part of this team working to achieve those efforts.
I should have said something about North Korea, but it's a little bit hard sometimes when you look at a guy who looks like a James Bond villain and is actually living the entire, right down to the haircut and the suit. It's like you think he's a movie character unless you realize that it's terrifyingly real. Ted.
Just one thing.
Yes,
so
sir.
Again, I think that the issue is, do we collectively, with our allies and the defense industry, have the capacity to stay ahead of the capacity of the threats we're facing? And that's a big issue for all of us. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Ted.
I would agree with Bob's last statement because it's really important for us to maintain this technological lead. The reason why I argue this is because the bad guys, whether state or non-state actors, they too are getting very smart about the use of technology. Even if you look at a group like Islamic State, they're actually quite smart at trying to experiment with UAVs and so on. These can be weaponized. There's actually some evidence of them trying to make a UCAV, a very primitive one, using an East European airframe that was used from Syria and tried to enter Jordan about a year or so ago. This kind of working with technology and scraps, if you will, to make something that is threatening, I think is important. We also have to remember that groups like Islamic State or any other of the jihadist groups or terrorist groups out around the world, they're also trying to recruit scientists and so on to work on dirty bombs, biological weapons, chemical weapons. Even if it's just to make a mess, it's meant to be a psychological weapon. It's a concept that I call toxic warfare, that I wrote about 15 years ago when I was at RAND. I think that these ideas are still continuing to percolate in the red cell world, if you will, and it challenges us to be ahead of that curve to make sure that we're ready for that kind of event. With the state actors, I think they too are making their way towards trying to stay of the technological curve, but they're fighting it on an asymmetrical level. And one trend that I think is important to pay attention to is what I see as, or what we have called before, the Global Rejectionist Front, or GERF. And GERF is actually a group of countries that shares technologies together, particularly in the anti-air defense realm. And we've seen that ever since the war over Kosovo. You have these groups of countries that share this kind of information and data, and they're able to share technology. So as you have the trend lines of the non-state actors, the terrorist groups, and so on, they give, as well as the state actors, they just continue to improve their capabilities over time. That challenges a lot of what we see from our perspective of going after, in terms of defining and how to go after fourth generation warfare, how to go after hybrid warfare, particularly when we're seeing it in Ukraine or in Syria. So these are some of the trend lines that I think will affect the way that we go about designing weapon systems and coming up with contingencies and working on the con ops that are necessary to keep the enemy at bay.
Chris?
I take a look at it from the context of cyber attacks, and I think the question that is getting a lot of thought these days are, where do cyber attacks fit into the next gen of military threats? And I think that everyone there in the room would agree there's a broad consensus that whether it's directly on the battlefield or in an ancillary context, cyber attacks are going to be a fact of life. And this has a profound ramification for, you're talking about the third offsets, Vago, and the military thinkers. What are the consequences of the U.S. having not a near peer, but a peer in the cyber realm? And how much thought have we given to non-state actors, second-tier threats, and near peers all converging in the cyber realm where disparities can be leveled and conflict may be addressed at that point? So it's a big issue for us with our future warfare. And what I think a real question that there is, we're talking about technology, but a real question for us all that's near and dear to my heart is how do we train and then retain the human capital who are the cyber experts for the next generation? I think that is, you talk about it in a regional context, that is a real issue, especially here in the Middle East, where manpower and human capital and developing human capital is a real priority, and where there's a shortfall. And how do you take your precious human resources and figure out you're going to put them in the manufacturing sector, you're going to put them in the military sector, where do they fit in the cybersecurity sector?
Simon?
I support everything the other panelists have said, and I guess that's one of the drawbacks of speaking last. And I was going to talk about cyber, I was going to talk about asymmetric threats, and they're gone. So what I will say though is sort of, I guess in bringing it all together, countering that next generation threat, and especially the asymmetric threat, where by the very nature of what an asymmetric threat is, you don't really know what it is, and it's really hard to counter that. I think the impetus is on defence industry and also the defence forces of the region, the defence forces of the world, to try and find a way where we can, on a more regular basis, work together and communicate up front as looking at the development of that technology that we need to then defeat that threat. And, we can use terms like spiral development and using technology that we've got before, but I think we really need to keep working towards that and really working more closely with the defence partners and the defence forces to look at these threats, to look at that the next generation of asymmetric threat, for example, and try and get out in front of it. I mean, it's really hard to defend against, well, I guess you look at the 80s, a guy in a jet ski with an RPG on his shoulder, and the tragedy of, say, USS Cole or something like that. How can we work together to get out in front of that and then maybe come up with systems and technologies that will enable us to be that one step ahead of, the bad guys, so to speak, so that we can, avoid these tragedies that sort of then lead into, a next generation of development of technology. I'd like to see it the other way around and have that next generation of technology before we get that next generation of threat.
I'd just like to add, you've heard several of the speakers talk about asymmetry. I would go back to the cyber realm and have us think about where there are multiple players who are almost peers, and then at that point in time, asymmetry is anyone's ballgame. It's not typically something that the U.S. warfighter has thought about. We've always thought about defending against asymmetry, but in the cyber realm, as I said, asymmetry could be anyone's ballgame, and I think that's important to start thinking along those lines, particularly the U.S. warfighters.
Well, what are some asymmetries? I mean, the way the first offset strategy worked was we used nuclear weapons, for example, and said we're going to look for a nuclear first defense or offense, if you will, to counteract the Soviet advance and be able to reduce our ground forces. Second offset strategy was the sheer number of missiles the Soviets were building, the conventional overmatch capability. We came up with stealth, the entire reconnaissance complex, as the Soviets used to call it, with GPS to allow guidance, precision munitions, Pershings. I mean, we did all of that stuff to offset their advantage. What are some of the things that we can do in this phase, even though the third offset strategy is the beginning of a long journey of thinking this through? What are some, how do we bound and define the problem we face? And then what are some possible asymmetric solutions we can apply to it?
I would say, I would address it from an industry perspective and say, what is industry's role in defining, the issue? And I agree that you were mentioning, a need for a greater dialogue with our defense partners. I would say that there is an urgent need, particularly in the United States with sequestration over the last decade or so, that the industry-to-government dialogue on next-gen threats and what solutions are needs to be rejuvenated. And most people would say it's probably not where it should be. So I would say a critical role of industry is to help begin that dialogue again.
I just wanted to add that I think it's important to consider the cost of what needs to be done in the near term and the medium term. The economies of the region, including and outside the region, are under a lot of pressure. Every precious currency needs to be spent accurately, and it goes to the importance of being able to determine what that asymmetric threat will be in 10 years in order to make sure that the programming is correct. I have to agree with you that cyber, of course, is becoming increasingly important, and at the same time, these peer competitors, we have to understand exactly how much money they're spending in order to determine how quickly they're going and how are they evolving their doctrine of cyber warfare. There needs to be a lot of studies about how these other countries like China and Russia are doing this, as well as understanding, particularly with the Kremlin's offensive in Ukraine and in Syria, how they're using information warfare. The information sphere is very rich, and we need to be able to get ahead of that in order to put out the appropriate messages, but also make sure that they get to the appropriate listeners and break down barriers that exist.
From a Chinese context, it's like information is one of the three warfares. The Russians, even in new generation warfare, are doing the same sort of thing.
Right. I mean, it goes back to what the black colonels were saying way back in the day, and this was something that the Chinese were doing and have pursued for many years. Now, what the Chinese are doing specifically is combining their security perspective with their One Belt, One Road policy, which is an overarching geoeconomic trans-regional program that basically puts the Chinese Navy in just about every port in between Beijing, if you will, and the Mediterranean. So we need to be able to keep ahead of that push.
Admiral?
Well, I just worry some about our prioritization and understanding what capacity you can grow. If you look at, after 9/11, one of the segments of the defense industry that grew and prospered the most was our intel apparatus. Their budget quadrupled, their manpower tripled. We have intel officers as 4-star admirals. Whoever thought that would happen before. And yet, we missed this Islamic State threat. So did the money we put into that get us the return we wanted? And I would say not. So we're going to have to be very astute and realistic in this tighter fiscal environment of how we apply those resources and when we look at it. And I would also suggest we need to be prepared because there are more black swan events around the corner every day because of this advanced technology. I'm willing to bet in my lifetime we'll see a yield event. I'll bet in my lifetime we'll see our inability to use space. I'm saying we've seen disruption of services, but we've known there are entities who can completely take out your internet capabilities. So how are we going to operate in any of those environments today? Because I don't know when they're going to happen, but I'm willing to bet the farm they will happen. And so prioritizing, using the resources, understanding we've not been good stewards, and I don't mean us, but I mean nation states and those resources, have not been the best stewards of that money, and we're all going to be jockeying to help frame the discussion and prioritize how those resources are applied.
Margo, I'd just like to bring up a small point on, Bob, you talked about operating in a battle space that's informationally degraded. I think there's a small but interesting admission of that in the U.S. service academies. The U.S. Naval Academy is now back to teaching celestial navigation. Not that, that...
Did anyone here ever have to take celestial nav? We want them to suffer as much as we did, don't we?
I think it's just a coded admission that people need to understand, the greater world about them rather than just being able to read information that's coming off a digital screen and have an awareness of where they are.
I was going to just put in a plug for a Norris Nautical Almanac app that needs to come out now, so that we can all do it. But I guess just adding on to that, well, I do believe, and as I said, I was going to bring up cyber security and that sort of thing as well. I think in this region in particular, we also need to find the balance, because not all of the organisations that the battle is against at the moment have that. Well, I won't say they don't have the technical capability, but they're not actually physically using it as yet. And like you said, Bob, you would like to bet that this will happen, and we don't know how we will go against it. But I think in the interim between now and when that actually happens, we need to use our cyber, and Chris, like you were saying about using that cyber asymmetry to our advantage, but knowing that it isn't necessarily going to, in the next might be 2, 5, 10 years, isn't necessarily going to be an apples to apples sort of battlefield comparison. And how do we use our technology in that advantage now and work together to get that technology together against what is still that traditional asymmetric threat?
I want to open it up to the floor to questions. Hands? Absent? There you go. Just identify yourself, please. Identify yourself, please. And, oh, look, there's microphones coming.
Hi, my name is Richard Welford. I'm from Tata. I wanted to ask the entire panel, actually, because I was actually a bit intrigued about these kind of black swan events and the repurposing of technology in creative ways by perhaps the new threat, the emerging threat, and bodies that we've never even considered before. Just wanted to dwell on that a little minute and wonder, what is the defense industry and the big players within the defense industry doing to think differently about that threat? In what way this isn't about the conventional rules of war now. So in what way is the defense industry gearing itself up to bring different thought patterns in place, different predictive patterns in place, such that you might actually adopt something more like a startup company, a mentality like a startup, to be disruptive in the defense thinking, rather than simply create another weapon system in the way that a weapon system may have traditionally been produced. Is there a space for startup mentality and actually the kind of resources, to the point you spoke about getting the right resources in the cyberspace, but are you actually, are you looking for the right resources that can think like startups in the defense industry?
I'll come off that. And this is from a context of working with Raytheon, that the company has come to a conclusion that the innovation and creativity that exists in the commercial cyber realm needs to be brought into the aerospace and defense realm and then transferred over to the government sector. So from that perspective, you'd seen over the last 10 years or so, almost 12 acquisitions of cyber talent, formal companies that were existing in the commercial cyber realm. And there's been a purposeful decision to try to keep some of those companies away from the aerospace and defense culture, and to let them operate as they are in the commercial cyberspace market. So I think that's a really important distinction that the company has made, and I think part of our role is to act as an interlocutor between the commercial cyber realm, the aerospace and defense realm, and the government realm. I know I spoke a lot about cyber, but you can obviously tell I think this is a huge component.
But how are you setting the exam question for that new talent? I mean, are they, in terms of what challenges are you setting, how are you setting the problem statement for those new teams? Are they essentially still solving traditional problems Or do they have the opportunity to set the exam question themselves, to think out of the box?
Of course, you're trying to encourage creativity, absolutely. But that can only come with a dialogue from the people, from the end users, the people from whom the requirements are coming, which I spoke to earlier about having a closer dialogue with government.
Yeah, I agree. I think all of us in larger defence companies obviously have those innovative areas, and we have those young, brilliant engineers who have come straight out of universities who've got really big brains and that sort of thing. The key, I think, from my side, having worked with companies like that, is how do you grab those guys and girls with the big brains and tell them that what they're trying to develop, this is what you need it to do. It's not just ones and zeros and working out how an active phased array radar is going to work, for example. It's knowing what the operation of that active phased array radar is going to do and what you need it to do. And that's where I think we need to be more involved with, say, intelligence organisations as much as we can, because obviously there's sensitivities around that, and putting our gun squads of innovators and that within the company, because you can just do it within the company, and I think that's what we've been doing for many years now as well. But I think to be truly effective, you need to link that, and I don't know how you necessarily do this off the top of my head, but link those innovative thinkers, the really smart people, with the intel guys, and have us provide that bridge between it, because I think that's how we then get out ahead of what that next threat might be, because the intel guys have got the most information about what the threat will be. We've got the guys sort of sitting at the other end who have got the big brains and how they can put it all together. But in my mind, I think they're operating a little bit too much in isolation, and I think between defence and defence industry, we should probably be trying to bring that a little closer together to meet what you're talking about.
Thank you. And I don't want to monopolise the questions time. So maybe just as a passing thought, does the defence industry consider more networking in terms of networking with organisations and companies outside of the defence industry to try and bring that creative spirit into play? Just maybe as a thought rather than necessarily open for questions unless you have the time.
I think to a certain extent, the governments of countries that we're working in do that for us by introducing things like offset programs. You're moving towards bringing in more commercial rather than more defence-related companies, and by working with them, you naturally find, hang on, there's something different here that I think could be used in this level of technology as well. So I think that side of thing, while we're thinking of it, I think it's in certain countries, it's actually, you're being, I won't say forced, but you're being driven down that path to work with those companies as well. And I think we can only all see benefit out of that in the long run.
One of the things that DoD, for example, if you saw last week, Ash Carter went to Silicon Valley on his latest visit there, announced one of the initiatives he announced was to let hackers get rewards to try to break into DoD websites. The second thing, to find and to share those weaknesses with DoD. The second thing was getting Eric Schmidt, the former Google CEO, the Alphabet chairman, to head a 12-man advisory panel that will advise him directly. Eric's going to have a lot of latitude to pick the top tech minds and put it on this panel. And the panel is going to be advising him on technology. It doesn't have any defense-specific people. That's just the Silicon Valley thing. One of the challenges and one of the drivers of the innovation initiative is a concern that the defense contractors, which are great at executing defense at scale, have a lot of positions that they're in. So defense contractors are innovative and do pick up technology all the time and spin it out. You saw it from Chris. Lockheed has done it as well in terms of Blue Origin, which is a tremendous partnership to get into the SpaceX game when SpaceX started to affect ULA and ULA's profitability, which was a great response by the company, but sometimes has a tendency of being difficult to think totally out of the box. And so this is a way to to try to get into a different sort of a cycle, because everybody recognizes that the third offset doesn't work if you can't turn within the turning circle of your adversaries. And right now, when you have Joint Strike Fighter programs, and this is not a slight on Lockheed, it is the most complicated program ever, so it's not like this thing was going to come out, 24-hour, sort of like it's not like a 24-hour laundry, you're going to get a product. But, the challenge is, how do you accelerate the cycle? And if you look at everything the department's been doing over the last 8 years, has all been geared to this. The whole acquisition reform drive is the acceleration of the process by trying to empower program managers, for example. So it's a really extraordinary thing to try to match, I think, what the Admiral was involved in the special operations community of being adaptive and rapid, to try to apply that to other parts of the force is really, I think, an admirable thing. So that's part of, I think, what's happening. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Of course, there are a variety of technologies that's going to influence the maritime battle space, but if I have to name three which will have a significant impact in the way we look at threats in the future, would be robotics, automation, and miniaturization. Up till now, we've been looking at being able to neutralize a big threat. And as these technologies move on terms of robotics, automation, and miniaturization, navies may have to, or any other armed force, have to look at being able to neutralize a host of small threats. And that can be swarm drones, it can be a variety of surface and submersibles, which would all require industry to conceptualize a completely different set of response systems. I'd be grateful to hear some views on how does these three technologies, which could create miniature threats in large numbers to defeat forces which are more structured to dealing with large threats. Thank you.
I think somebody with Admiral in his name might be a good person to start here.
Yeah. You know, when you've captured three critical ones, but there's so many more out there. You look at the way computers functioning and now what we do, all electronically. I see in the future, and you could talk to Wall Street, photonic computing is around the corner. But how do we, as industry, move that forward? And Navy systems are the first one to incorporate some of that technology. So back to that partnership with not only the innovators, but the services, and taking those risks and programs to move forward with these is huge. But anytime we can get smaller, we can get lighter, we can get faster. And with photonics, for less cooling, less power, all those elements play across industry. But it's a challenge, again, going back to the defense industry and even the Hill, where they have certain resources, and again, squeezed to dedicate these ones. So that collaboration, and back to your initial point, how do we partner with these real innovators to do that? And I think all of our industries, we invest a lot of money at that, and we take a lot of great risk where sometimes we're creating competimates in some regard. But everyone's willing to do that because where it's going to get us collectively to do that. Again, so the panoply of elements and functions we can do, robotics, miniaturization, all those type of things is play. But how do you prioritize in your industry? And being the new guy to Lockheed Martin too, boy, moving the beast is like turning an aircraft carrier. It's hard. So Ash Carter's got his hands full, but he came in with that agenda when he was DepSecDef. So there's one of those guys who have made great strides, and getting that carrier 3 or 4 degrees to the right, or another analogy, getting Army closer to winning a football game. But moving those things take a long time and a lot of focus and energy to do it. So first and foremost, critical to that is people. So our investment in people, motivating, giving them the opportunities and empowering, I think is the turning point in that.
My sense in asking that question was to look at how the transition from kinetic kills to direct energy kills will take place in the future. You know, you may not need the kinetic kills anymore if the technologies move, as I believe Lockheed Martin is doing some work on laser warfare systems, etc. So that might completely change the way weapons platforms are structured, that you don't have this huge amount of projectiles which have to be shot off into space to neutralize other potential threats, but you start looking at directed energy weapon systems, laser weapon systems, to get those kills.
I think that's a perfect example. Not only did Lockheed invest a lot of money into that, but the Navy took great risks. They built a system, put it on a ship, deployed it. Even where they knew it was a science project, not a defined capability, they were willing to go out and test in an operational deployment what it would take to maintain it, what the power effect on the rest of the ship. They took great leaps on that. You look at the Marines and the K-MAX helicopter, unmanned helicopter, still a science project, but they deployed it to Afghanistan, flew it as a logistics between hubs to keep guys off the road to IED. So everyone took risks across the board. The company that built, because it could have gone wrong, the services who deployed the capability forward, even though they knew it wasn't valid, and that's indicative of what we're all going to have to do: accept more risk and invest time, energy, and sometimes professional risk at bringing these to fruition. So I think your example of laser energy is a perfect example. And with our partners here in UAE, they're willing to invest in that as well. But we want to make sure they understand it's still a science project at this time. And we're getting great partnerships and collaboration to do that sort of thing.
I would say that there's going to be a mix. I don't think you can get rid of the old school kinetic solution. I know that industry's heavily investing in, say, high-powered microwaves, high-energy lasers, and if you're going after a collaborative or an autonomous threat, then there's also going to be a digital solution. But I would respectfully disagree that a kinetic solution is too old school to consider in the future. In fact, I'd say a lot of companies, industry in collaboration with government, are looking at actually improving their kinetic solutions.
The big driver is the cost of it. I mean, if you have China and they're making 300...
I'm not current where we are exactly on the capability right now. I would tell you we have a stronger partnership with a more collaborative crowd of partners working on this. And again, operational deployments have already occurred to see the effects on it. So I think we're making progress, but I think it'd be inappropriate to discuss where we are today with that capability. But again, that's another one of those black swan events where it won't sacrifice or compromise our other capabilities, but it sure is another tool in the kit.
Sorry, I ask you because you have in Lawrence Livermore Laboratory the most powerful actual laser, 1.3 petawatts. The second one, 1.1, is in Bucharest, and we have under construction investment 386 million euros, the most powerful 20 petawatts. But I know that you are working together with Lawrence Livermore, which is very normal. And I ask you if there is some connection between these two types of lasers to produce new weapons.
And again, excuse me, I'm just a simple SEAL. I don't know. So we'll have to try. We'll try to get through the end.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for now. Please thank our panelists, Bob, Ted, Chris, Simon. Thank you very much for joining us.